The 1960s were a wild frontier, a time when Detroit built machines so powerful they scared the very people who created them. Today we revisit the 12 most dangerous muscle cars of that fearless decade. I hope you're feeling well today, and ready to slip back into an era when courage mattered as much as horsepower. The 1969 Camaro ZL1 felt less like something built in Detroit and more like something unleashed. It carried an all-aluminum 427 cubic inch heart that officially whispered 430 horsepower, yet every mechanic who touched it knew the truth sat far north of that number. With a compression ratio around 12:1 and a solid lifter cam that shook the car at idle, the engine behaved like it could barely tolerate ordinary roads. It wanted the quarter mile, not the morning commute. Press the throttle too soon and the rear tires, narrow bias ply relics of the era, would surrender instantly. The live rear axle hopped, twisted, and clawed for grip as the chassis fought to contain a storm it was never designed to hold. Brakes that mixed front discs with rear drums faded after only a few hard stops, turning high-speed confidence into a long and uncertain prayer. Steering offered quick ratios but little feedback, as if the front end refused to warn you when the limit was near. Yet there was a strange beauty in that danger. When the talk swept past 4,000, the ZL1 came alive. The big Holly perched on its aluminum intake, pulling air like a creature that finally smelled open space. In those moments, the world narrowed to the roar of a big block, doing exactly what it was born to do. Only a handful of these machines ever left the factory, sold to drivers who believed they were ready for a race car disguised as a street car. If you're enjoying this journey into the wild side of American muscle, feel free to subscribe and ride with us as we uncover the legends that defined an era. There was something almost misleading about the 1969 Barracuda Formula S with the 383 under its hood. It looked compact, almost harmless, the kind of car a young driver might trust without thinking twice. Yet once that big block cleared its throat, and the Holly breathed in, the little A-body revealed just how wild it could become. With more than 300 horsepower and a surge of torque that felt endless, the car pushed barely 3,000 pounds forward with a force that seemed to outrun its own shadow. But the danger was woven into its bones. The unibody flexed under hard throttle, the doors shifting slightly as the chassis twisted. Up front, torsion bars and soft spring rates struggled to hold the heavy engine, letting the nose dive deep when the brakes were called upon. Out back, the leaf springs wound tight before snapping back in violent wheel hop, shaking the car as if the rear axle were trying to break free. And with a short wheelbase, every transfer of weight came suddenly, with no gentle warning and no margin for lazy hands on the wheel. Steering felt heavy at low speeds, and on narrow roads the driver had to coax the car into line, sensing its limits more through vibration than feedback. Yet when the road opened and the big block found its rhythm, the Barracuda moved with a raw, unapologetic energy that only the late 60s could produce. If this compact troublemaker sparks something in you, let me know. Drop a comment with a simple yes or no, just to see how many of us remember when small cars with big hearts demanded real respect from the driver. The 1968 Mustang Cobra Jet arrived like a quiet rebellion inside a familiar shape. From a distance it looked like any other fastback prowling American streets. But under that long hood lived a big block that seemed far too wild for a car this size. The engine breathed through larger valves, a freer exhaust, and a cam that pulled hard from the moment the revs climbed. Ford claimed a modest 335 horsepower, but anyone who drove one knew the truth rested far beyond that. The torque felt endless, rising with a smooth violence that pushed the Mustang forward as if the road itself were moving underneath. Yet the danger was born from the very heart that made it quick. The big block sat high and far forward, loading the nose with weight it was never meant to carry. Turn the wheel and the front end hesitated, plowing wide before settling into the corner. Coil springs and stamped wishbones worked as hard as they could, but the body rolled deep and the nose dove sharply the moment the brakes were called upon. Out back, the leaf springs squatted under acceleration, planting the rear tires, but lifting the steering just when precision mattered most. The brakes, discs up front and drums behind, were strong for the era, but overwhelmed when the Mustang was pushed. Fade crept in quickly, stretching, stopping distances, and testing nerves. Still, when the big block found its rhythm and the air rushed through the hood scoop, the Cobra jet offered a kind of raw thrill only the late 60s could create. It was a machine that rewarded courage, punished carelessness, and reminded every driver that real power never comes without a price. The 1969 GTO Judge Ram Air 4 did not simply arrive on American roads. It made an entrance, loud and impossible to ignore, wrapped in colors that looked stolen from a rock concert poster and wearing graphics that dared anyone to look away. Beneath the showmanship lived a 400 cubic inch engine built for racers who understood that real power comes only when the needle sweeps past the middle of the tack. At lower revs, it felt sleepy, as if conserving its strength, but once the crank spun beyond the 4,000 mark, the round port heads filled with air, the cam opened wide, and the Judge delivered a surge that felt almost theatrical. Yet that wild personality carried danger of its own. The power band was narrow, demanding constant attention. Shift too early and the engine fell flat, leaving the car heavy and uncertain. Hold the gear too long and you risked pushing the valve train beyond what it could endure. The suspension, coils at every corner, kept the ride smooth, but let the body roll deep in fast corners. The recirculating ball steering felt light yet vague, more suggestion than command. And the front discs paired with rear drums were strong until heat crept in and fade, stretched every stopping distance. Still, drivers lined up to own this machine because it felt like a piece of the culture that defined the era. It carried the spirit of late-night drag strips, the echo of "Here Come the Judge" from television, and the bold confidence of a generation that believed speed and style belonged together. In the hands of someone skilled, the Ram Air 4 felt alive. In the hands of someone careless, it reminded them why legends always come with a warning. The 1967 Corvette L88 lived in a world far beyond ordinary road cars, a world of pit lanes, open headers, and men who measured courage the way others measured horsepower. On the surface, it still looked like a sleek C2 Corvette, all curves, fiberglass, and familiar lines. But beneath that long hood waited a 427 cubic inch heart built by racers, not marketers. Its compression pushed past the point where pump fuel could ever survive. Its cam was so wild the idle shook like a living thing, and its real power rose well above what Chevrolet dared to print in brochures. With the needle past 4,000, the big block roared with the kind of force that made quarter-mile runs fall into the low 12s and pushed the car toward speeds most drivers had never tasted. Yet every part of the chassis whispered danger. The transverse leaf spring at the rear could tuck the wheels under the body without warning, sending the tail stepping out in a snap. The front end carried the weight of the engine like a burden, diving hard under brakes, the nose pushing wide as the limits came and went in a breath. Even the brakes, discs at all corners, faded quickly as heat soaked in. There was no heater, no radio, no insulation, only noise, heat, vibration, and the raw honesty of a machine that cared nothing for comfort. Most L88s went straight to race teams who understood what they were buying, but a few found their way to private garages, where owners quickly discovered that a race car with plates is still very much a race car. If you are still with me on this wild ride, drop the number 5 in the comments. It is my way of knowing you are the kind of person who appreciates the legends that refuse to compromise. The 1969 Charger RT Hemi carried the kind of presence that filled a street long before the engine ever started. Its fastback line swept like a single brushstroke of steel, and beneath that long hood waited the legendary 426 Hemi, a motor born on racetracks long before it ever wore license plates. At idle it felt lazy, almost distracted, but when the Toch climbed past the 3,000 mark, the Hemi woke with a violence that pushed the big Dodge forward as if tugged by something unseen. The surge came fast, hard, and without apology. Yet sheer power was only half the story. The Charger was long, heavy, and full of momentum. a car that demanded planning before every corner. Turn the wheel too quickly, and the front end pushed wide, the weight of the big block dragging the nose toward the outside of the road. Ask too much from the rear, and the leaf spring suspension began to wind up, storing energy until it snapped back in wheel hop that shook the entire car. When the Hemi came alive, that little moment between grip and chaos passed in a blink, and many drivers found themselves sideways before they even understood what had happened. The steering offered more play than precision, leaving the driver guessing what the front tires were saying. The brakes, discs up front and drums behind, worked well enough for a gentle cruise, but fade crept in the moment speeds reached the triple digits the Hemi so effortlessly delivered, and through it all, the body flexed just enough to remind you that even a unibody car this size had limits. Still, the Charger held a strange allure. It made ordinary roads feel like they were part of something larger, something wilder. In the hands of a skilled driver, it was a statement. In the hands of anyone else, it was a warning written in steel, sound, and the unmistakable roar of the Hemi coming into its power. The 1968 Roadrunner arrived in showrooms, stripped of everything except the promise of speed. Plymouth built it with a kind of stubborn honesty, shaving away comfort until only steel, noise, and a big block heartbeat remained. The base 383 had enough torque to shove the car through a quarter-mile in the mid-14 range, but the true mischief lived in the optional 440. That motor pulled with a low rumble that grew into a deep, rising roar, the kind that made a young driver believe the world could be outrun if he kept his foot down long enough. Yet danger was folded into the Roadrunner's design as tightly as its sheet metal. The simplified suspension, torsion bars up front and leaf springs in the rear, fought to keep the car composed but never quite won. Body roll leaned the coupe into corners like a ship in heavy water, while squat and dive shifted weight violently whenever the throttle or brakes were touched. Drum brakes at all four corners faded fast, turning speed into a gamble whenever the road narrowed or a light turned red. The 4-speed gearbox, with its low first gear and wide leap to second, invited hard launches followed by sudden losses in traction. A missed shift or a rough clutch drop could snap the rear tires loose in an instant, sending the car sideways with a burst of tire smoke and youthful overconfidence. Many Roadrunners met their end that way, not from mechanical failure but from the simple truth that power was cheap, speed was easy, and experience was optional. The Roadrunner became a symbol of its era, a loud reminder that performance without restraint could thrill, terrify, and teach, all at the same time. The 1969 Cougar Eliminator felt like a machine caught between two worlds. Mercury dressed it as the gentleman's muscle car, quieter than a Mustang, smoother in the cabin, trimmed in colors and textures meant to impress a buyer who wanted speed without giving up comfort. Yet under the hood waited the 428 Cobra jet, a motor that cared nothing for manners. It pulled with a deep, rising force that pushed the Cougar through a quarter-mile in the mid-13 range and carried its weight with surprising authority. Torque arrived early, swelling across the revs like a slow-building storm. But the danger lay in the weight that came with that refinement. The longer wheelbase added stability in a straight line, but made the car slower to react when the road curved. Hideaway headlights and layers of insulation over the firewall loaded the nose, creating a front-heavy balance that pushed wide when the driver asked too much. The soft springs and plush shocks, tuned for comfort, allowed the body to wallow and lean, turning quick transitions into slow, uneasy motions that tested a driver's patience and skill. The steering was light and overboosted, a wheel that floated in the hands without telling the truth about what the front tires were gripping. Push the brakes hard, and fade crept in before long, stretching stopping distances as the big cat gained speed with a confidence the chassis could not match. And many drivers who bought the Eliminator did so for its looks and luxury, not for the discipline needed to handle real performance. In the end, the Cougar Eliminator became a reminder that strength wrapped in silk can be the most deceptive kind. It was powerful, elegant, and ready to bite the moment its beauty was mistaken for safety. The 1967 Camaro SS 396 marked the moment Chevrolet stepped into the pony car war with more than style. It carried a big block that felt far too eager for a chassis still learning what real power meant. He 396 breathed through high compression heads and a strong cam, pulling the car forward with a surge that made the quarter-mile fall somewhere in the mid-13 range and pushed the needle past 60 miles an hour in barely more than a heartbeat. Its sound was deep and raw, a kind of promise whispered through steel and gasoline. But the danger lived in the spaces the factory had not yet perfected. The unibody flexed when the driver launched hard, the cowl shifting just enough to be felt through the wheel. Up front, coil springs and unequal control arms carried the weight of the big block, but tight corners brought understeer, the nose pushing wide before the tires regained their grip. The rear, suspended by multi-leaf springs and a solid axle, could step sideways the instant the car hit a mid-corner bump, turning a smooth arc into a sudden correction. Steering came through a recirculating ball setup that felt slow and distant, leaving a wide patch of play at center and demanding nearly 4 full turns from lock to lock. At speed, those extra moments mattered. The brakes, discs up front and drums behind, faded quickly under repeated hard use. With most of the weight over the nose, the front rotors worked themselves to exhaustion while the rear drums locked early, snapping the car into a spin if the driver misjudged pressure. The SS396 was a beautiful machine, a bold first step for a new generation of Chevrolet performance. But beneath its confident lines, it reminded every driver that strength without balance is a lesson waiting to be learned the hard way. The 1969 Torino Cobra carried itself with the quiet confidence of a heavyweight that knew its strength. Ford built it to stand tall against the Chevelle and the GTO, and beneath its long sweeping hood lived the 429 Cobra jet, a motor that made light work of the factory numbers printed in brochures. The official rating whispered 375 horsepower, but the real surge felt far stronger, a deep wave of torque arriving low in the revs and pushing the big midsize forward with surprising urgency. Quarter miles in the low 13 range and sprints to 60 that came in only a few breaths proved it belonged among the quickest machines of its day. But raw speed was only half the story. The Torino carried weight like a burden, nearly 2 tons of steel and intent, and once it gathered momentum, it demanded space and respect. The long hood lifted under throttle, narrowing the driver's view as the big block came alive. The suspension, tuned more for comfort than precision, allowed the body to lean deeply into corners, the car pausing before it responded, as if considering the request before changing direction. Leaf springs at the rear wound up under hard acceleration, then snapped back in wheel hop that could rattle the entire car. Steering came through a recirculating ball system that felt slow and distant, making quick corrections difficult. The brakes, discs up front and drums behind, worked well enough for cruising, but repeated stops from high speeds brought fade fast, stretching braking distances far beyond what the driver expected. In its calm moments, the Torino Cobra felt steady and composed, almost gentle. But press deeper, ask for everything, and it revealed the truth of its era. Power was abundant, control was optional, and balance, on a machine this strong and this heavy, belonged only to those who truly knew what they were doing. The 1968 Dart GTS looked harmless at first glance, a compact shape meant for errands and quiet streets. But Dodge had slipped a big block beneath its modest skin, a 433 cubic inch heart that delivered far more power than the A-body platform was ever meant to carry. With well over 300 horsepower pushing a car barely tipping 3,000 pounds, the Dart launched with a sudden, almost startling urgency. Quarter miles in the low 14 range and sprints to 60 that felt like a blink confirmed it was far more than a budget machine. Yet danger lived in every corner of its design. The A-body frame rails were thin, the structure never intended to absorb the twisting force of big block torque. Under a hard launch, the entire nose would rise and the cowl would tremble, as if the car were fighting to stay in one piece. Torsion bars up front allowed the nose to dive deeply under braking, while the leaf-sprung rear axle wound itself tight with each surge of power. When traction broke, the stored energy snapped loose in violent wheel hop that shook the chassis like a struck drum. The steering, slow and heavy, offered little guidance when the road demanded quick decisions. Drum brakes at all 4 corners faded fast as speeds climbed, stretching, stopping distances until every red light felt like a calculation. And with the weight of the big block hanging over the front wheels, the Dart pushed wide in corners, plowing forward no matter how firmly the driver turned the wheel. It was a machine defined by contradiction. Small but brutal, simple but unforgiving. In the hands of a skilled driver, it delivered raw excitement. In the hands of anyone else, it reminded them that not every engine belongs in every body. The 1967 Firebird 400 arrived late to the pony car fight, but it walked in with the quiet confidence of something that knew its strength. Pontiac had taken a big block meant for heavier mid-size machines and tucked it into a compact F-body, a body never meant to carry that much muscle. The 400 cubic inch V8 pulled with a deep, rolling surge of torque, enough to shove the lightweight coupe towards 60 miles an hour in a handful of seconds and send it through the quarter-mile in the mid-14 range. It was quick in a way that felt raw, unfiltered, and just a little reckless. What made it dangerous was not the power alone, but the way the chassis reacted to it. The nose carried more weight than the engineers had hoped, pushing wide as the driver turned in. And if he lifted the throttle mid-corner, the balance swung rearward so suddenly that the back tires would slip free, sending the car into a drift that felt less like a choice and more like a lesson. The steering, quick for its time, gave little warning. It told you what the front tires were doing only after they had already begun to surrender. Drum brakes on base models stretched stopping distances far beyond what the engine encouraged. Even with front discs, fade arrived quickly as heat soaked the system. Bias ply tires, narrow and uncertain, struggled to keep up with the forces being asked of them. And through all of it, the Firebird's sleek lines and aggressive stance urged drivers to push harder than the car could safely manage. The Firebird 400 became a reminder that beauty and danger often travel together, especially when power arrives in a body that was never meant to contain it. The machines of the 1960s were bold, beautiful, and often far more dangerous than their creators admitted. Each one carried the spirit of a decade when power ruled and caution came second. Thank you for taking this ride with American Muscle Soul. If this journey through the wild side of classic performance spoke to you, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more stories waiting, and I'd be honored to share the next one with you.